All right. Well, I am thrilled to be joined on this first episode of Life Well Led by my good friend and mentor, Ryan Berg. Ryan and I got to know each other, hate to tell you, it's been over 20 years now.
Yeah.
We're getting old.
It's when I had hair and my hair wasn't white.
Yeah, well, there you go. Now we know why there's the hat.
It's a bit more okay. I don't actually mind being bald. I actually don't mind being bald at all. But some days I go with the hat. I'm not exactly sure why.
Hey, no shame in that. No shame in that. Yeah, Ryan was a really important figure in my life during my college years. He was on staff with the campus ministry when I was a student, and really put his arm around me at a key time and helped me figure out some things in life, and just continues to be a friend and a mentor and someone I look up to as a leader. So it seemed fitting that you would be the person to kick off this new chapter for me with the podcast. So without further ado, let's get into it here. So when we first met, as I just said, I was in college, and at that time, I looked at you as like a seasoned vet of adulthood. You know, you had a job and a wife and a kid and a mortgage. And I just thought, wow, this guy's so far ahead of me. He's got, you're this like wise old sage. But as I was reflecting back on that season here in preparation for this conversation, I thought, gosh, Ryan wasn't really that old back then. I mean, you would have been in your, maybe late 20s, 2003, 2004. So I can imagine that there was probably a lot that you were still trying to figure out about life, leadership, calling, and so forth. And so the question I want to begin with is, as you think back on that time, in my mind, you're this old wise guy who I'm just figured it all out and I'm learning from. But as you think back on that season, what were some of the things you were learning then as I was learning from you? What stands out?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I would have been maybe my mid-20s. And, like you said, it was our first child. I had no idea. I had never been around little kids. I didn't know what fatherhood was meant to be, all those sort of things.
Shout out to Carter.
Yeah. See, turning 21 this month.
Wow.
Just crazy. But I would say some of the biggest things that I was processing at that time was trying to understand, in many ways, kind of my identity, my value exists where, with you, and in what way does that then start to impact the way I live out my life? And I remember, and part of the challenge with that was because growing up, I was on the way I'm wired, kind of the Enneagram test. For those people that are familiar with the Enneagram, I score a high 3 is what's called the achiever. There's some great things about that, can really beneficial. But some of the challenge to that is to then find your value or your identity in the achievements that you accomplish. And growing up as an athlete and, academics and things like that, we were held to a very high standard in our family. And so the idea was you want to be the best of the best. And whether it was inherently, or whether it was, directly stated or just me inherently sort of internalizing it, I equated performance with value. And so by the time I'm in my mid-20s, spending time with you, I was no longer, I no longer had academics where I could measure my value worth based on my academic performance. I no longer had college athletics where I could measure my value based on my athletic performance. At that point, it was kind of like, okay, I really have to start wrestling with where does my identity and value actually exist? Where is it blocked? Because certainly you can be humbled very quickly by a baby where you recognize, I have no idea what I'm doing here, and I have no idea how to measure if I'm being a good father in this moment or not. And so there was a lot of learning during that stage of life, and much of it had to do with, okay, who am I really, and where does my value actually lie? Some people have learned that much earlier on in life. For me, I would say in my mid-20s, that's where I was what I was wrestling with. And then the next question is, well, then what does that mean for where I'm headed for the
Mm-hmm.
rest of my life? And so that was a weighty question for me.
And when you said, would you say you spent, was that like yeah, for a year I wrestled with that, or for 18 months I wrestled with that, or do you look back and say, gosh, I spent a good chunk of my 20s wrestling through that, and it was a process, but over time I got more and more secure in kind of where that value is coming from.
Yeah, I would say it's almost kind of like the stock market, where it's like, oh, you got huge growth, and then you're like, oh man, that really, that's kind of what it felt like. Where um, there were times where it was super insightful, where I felt like, oh, yeah, I've made a lot of progress in understanding this. And then, if something not quite go the way I anticipated or something like that, or if I felt a sense of failure at something, I could feel some of that old stuff kind of coming up, and I have to, be quick to identify and say, wait a minute, that's not true.
Yeah. And would you say, as you talk to me here today as a 40 something year old, does that same thing still bubble up from time to time in terms of worth, value, performance, or have you sort of put that internal struggle to rest at this point?
For the most part, I think we put it to rest. I would say there's times though where it comes up for sure, especially if it's related to old or something like that. Especially if it's people that I maybe highly trust may say something that just pricks something
Mm-hmm.
deep rooted way. I can almost feel this sort of initial response, and wait, let me try and justify why I did it this way, and I catch myself much more quickly and go,
Yeah.
it's Ryan, it's not a big deal. It's you're rooted, and
Yeah.
you know who you are, you know where your value is. And so it may spike a little bit, but for the most part, it's kind of like, I'm okay with who I am. But yeah, but there are times where it can, just kind of get pricked.
Yeah. Well, trust me, you're talking to a fellow type 3, and I know all too well what that internal feeling is like. And for what it's worth, I mean, and I look back on kind of the legacy of your influence in my life and the things you modeled. I think that was partly why I was drawn to you, because I saw, okay, here's this guy who I resonate with in terms of ambition, achievement, even the athletic stuff, but yet I could tell you were arriving at a different relationship with that part of you than what I had at the time, and it struck me as healthy. And so you weren't maybe a finished product yet on that front in your 20s, but I could tell you were on the road to something healthier there in terms of your relationship with achievement. And I think it helped set me up to be on a healthier path as well.
Yeah. Well, and it's even interesting so like when you think of athletics, what was your experience like with athletics and performance and value and things like that? How did you process that out as an athlete?
Well, this is a perfect segue. You didn't know it, but this is where I'm headed next. It's interesting. I didn't play college sports like you did, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And so a lot of my, memories of competition come from high school, which was before faith had become an important part of my life. And so I feel like to this day, I'm still very much trying to figure out what does a healthy relationship with competition and particularly sport look like as I'm now raising athletes. Because what I'm left to draw upon are some good, helpful stuff, but I never really had the experience of competing fiercely with my identity and worth firmly rooted in something outside of me, which is God. And so I'm still trying to figure that one out. So I'm asking you the questions here, buddy. Don't be flipping it on me. I'm curious, as you look back on that season of your life, for listeners who may not know, you were a very good high school basketball player, recruited by some of the top programs in the country, but went and played, Division I basketball at Toledo, and had some injuries sort of intervene there to maybe shorten your career in terms of what it could have become. But I'm curious how you look back on that season of your life and how those experiences competing at a fairly high level and for a time having your identity, I think, pretty firmly in that world. How did those experiences shape you, and where in those experiences do you find some kind of warning and caution, but then where do you also find some help, some guidance, some, okay, because I experienced that, I now, lead differently or parent differently. I'm just curious kind of what the legacy of that period of your life competing at a high level has been for you.
Yeah, yeah. I loved it. I love competition. I love uh I love athletics. I love the idea that you get a group of people together that are focused on a common goal and they're willing to do whatever they need to together to actually accomplish it. And all of what that takes, getting up super early in the morning before everyone else, and you're working out together as a team, you're competing against each other, but you're sharpening each other so that then together we can turn and actually try and, beat the team we're competing against. And so I love that there's this sort of individual dynamic of sharpness and then this collective together. And so I loved all of those aspects. I just relish them. But in the same way, deep down, I was always constantly evaluating my worth, my identity based upon that performance. And it was hard not to. It was kind of like, hey, Berg, you went 0 for 7, and we need a better performance out of you. And if I did that, a couple games in a row, I could start to see my playing time dip. And so you start to learn very quickly, okay, this my value to the team is based on my performance. And that
You're as
makes
valuable
sense.
as your last performance, kind of thing.
Yep. Yep. The problem is I would translate that into then me personally, not me as a basketball player on that team, but me personally. I wasn't mature enough to draw that boundary between the two and say these are actually two very different things. And so for me, what it then started to do was helped me start to understand pretty quickly. And this was about the time I started to really explore faith as well, and started to understand that no, God actually designed me, created me to actually bear His image. He actually has a purpose for me. And what I started to realize is that my life was of far greater value to Him than my performance on basketball. And there was a phrase that almost kind of started to stick with me where it was, I'm bigger than this moment.
Right.
And not in some sort of like self-centered arrogant, but in this sort of worth. I'm valuable to the God of the universe, regardless of my performance on that basketball court. And that is infinitely more powerful than the praise of a coach or the praise in a newspaper or something like that for one game where I played really well. And so it started to help me understand, okay, truly in terms of my worth, my identity, I'm bigger than this moment. And I hope that phrase makes sense. It totally made sense to me
Yeah,
when
you're
I started
essentially
trying to
saying that
process it out.
there's a bigger story going on here than the
Yeah,
story of this game, this performance. And when you zoom out and kind of have a sense for that bigger story and the author of that story, it sounds like it brought you a lot of freedom.
100%. Yeah. And that's even to your question about the idea of how that's affected, even in terms of our parenting. As our kids are all involved in athletics. Our middle son is playing Division I football in college, and that's much of what we talked to them about. The idea of like, hey, we love you regardless of your performance. You're valuable to us. Doesn't matter what the performance looks like. We're going to call you to a really high level of excellence. We're going to challenge you to that, but it is in an environment of high warmth, high grace, high acceptance. So those two together, and Paul Tripp talks about this in terms of parenting and how that creates an environment where it allows children to thrive because they're able to take risks, they're able to do different things. Where maybe their personal identity and values isn't caught up in the failure of that risk that they take. And so I think for me that was one of the big things. What was like, all right, we're gonna really challenge our kids to excel and be excellent at what they do. But but at the same time to do it knowing that we are the safest place on the planet. We love them, cherish, value who they are, not because of what they do or how they. And I think that's a significant lesson learned from some of those initial days in college, starting to understand who God is and the fact He created me, He loves me, and then actually entering into that sort of relationship with Christ, where yeah, He would actually die on the cross on my behalf to take my failures and give me His righteousness, His successes, so that I would have a right standing before Him. I just thought, this is not how the world works. This is a grace and a kindness, warmth and generosity that I've never even heard of. And then once stepping into that, my goodness, it just frees you up to take audacious risk, calculated, wise, but also audacious, because
Yeah.
you're not concerned about working that stuff.
Yeah. The ultimate question for you has already been settled, so there's freedom to just let's take our shots here. But what I find interesting about your summary there and kind of your posture towards competition is there's a certain kind of even Christian person who might look at some of the things going on in athletics and, you kind of rising and falling with your performance and identity and all the icky stuff that can come with that. And they might go the other direction. That's so unhealthy. That's so toxic. Sports it's for fun. You shouldn't get that worked up about it. It's not really what matters. It's just a game, all this. But what I'm hearing you say is, no, it can be both and. There's a way to compete fiercely and to have high standards and to expect that if you're not performing well, you might be pulled from a game or not start or whatever it might be, while simultaneously fiercely affirming that, hey, your worth and your value is not tied up in any of that, which is compelling to me. But in practice, as a parent of athletes, I know how hard that can be. So I wondered if you might sort of take us into that a little deeper. And can you give us an example, maybe with one of your kids along the way, you don't have to mention my name, but where you sort of did the both and there, where there was something you were observing in the way they were competing where it's like, no, they're not meeting the standard. And I feel like I need to call them to that, but while simultaneously affirming that, hey, this doesn't in one iota affect our love and affection for you, nor God's.
Sure. Yeah, I'll give my best shot. So we've basically had to have those conversations with all three kids, and because all three, they're athletes. My wife was a college athlete, and so I would say it wasn't necessarily singular conversations, but over, ever since they were born, as much as we possibly could, over and over and over and over again, affirmed their value, their worth, their love. They are our sons and daughter in this family, and that will always be true. There is nothing that could possibly change that. So the whole time, in little different ways, in many different ways as we could, we're constantly affirming our love, our care, those sort of things. And yet at the same time, if at 2 years old or 3 years old, they're disobedient, we're going to let them know that that's not okay. You cannot do that. You are loved and affirmed, but you have crossed a boundary here, and that's not okay. Here's why: pain in your life, care about you too much to let you just run down that path. Well, if you kind of start to build that out forward, then we're having one conversation with one of our kids, and this particular child was like, "I'm really frustrated." Now, granted, this was younger, they're younger in their high school career, and they plenty of upperclassmen ahead of them, and they were really frustrated, like, "Oh, I want to be starting." And so we just asked the question. We said, well, how much extra time have you put in to get really excellent at what you're doing, to then be able to actually show on the field that your contributions to the team are of more value than that seniors, so that you can actually help the team win? And what we're trying to basically do is say, you have your individual tasks that you can actually go after to try and increase your individual skills. But it's not just simply about you. It's about the team together as a whole accomplishing the team goal. So have you done what you need to do to be able to contribute that value to the team so that you can actually help the team reach the team goal? And admittedly, this child was like, well, no, I really haven't, tried to really hone in some of the particular skills there. And we just simply said, that's okay. That's
Yeah.
okay. If you're okay with
Hmm.
not starting above that senior, that's okay. But if that's your individual goal, we can help you try to accomplish that. But if that's not your individual goal, we don't think less of you because of that. We don't value you less because of that. We don't, that's okay. And so in many ways, what we're trying to do is basically just affirm what is your goal? What are you wanting? What are you hoping to get out of this particular sport and the position? I don't know if that's the best way to go about it. What I did think was very neat was it allowed our child to really kind of hone in and say, well, yeah, really, really, what do I want to try and accomplish, and how do I want to contribute to the team, and am I willing to give more and pursue it? Or am I okay with like
Hmm.
enjoying the camaraderie on the team and giving my all, but not spending a bunch of extra time to try and exceed the skill set of the senior in front of me.
Yeah. It makes me think of a phrase I heard from an older sports dad a few years ago that stuck with me. I found helpful. He said, with our kids, we always tried to make sure that uh, appetite matched opportunity.
Yeah, yeah,
And to your point, it's, we're not telling them what their appetite should be in a given sport or activity to be better, to be excellent. But as parents, we try to be mindful of that. We had conversations about that, and then we would sort of match our level of support, opportunity, accountability to just be in alignment with what they were trying to accomplish. And that made sense to me, and what you're saying right now makes sense to me.
and we had plenty of conversations, where we're able to say, with some, one of our kids in particular, where it was like, hey, your skill set doesn't quite match the level of maybe what you're hoping to accomplish, and that's okay. Where else can you really contribute to the team and really go after this? And our child received it super well. It wasn't like,
Hmm.
oh my goodness, like you don't think I'm gonna be the smart
You don't
quarterback.
believe in me?
Yeah, they didn't. It was like they were like, oh yeah, you're right, and refocus the attention into the area where their strengths were much more aligned to what was needed, and
Yeah.
excelled really well.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing as you parent, you just realize there's all these key points along the way where you have almost an uncomfortable amount of influence to kind of guide, direct, point them away from this thing toward this thing. And, not that you're calling all the shots, but there's just a weightiness to that, with those conversations and what that can mean, for the rest of their life in terms of what they pursue and what that leads to. And yeah, I would say, as I'm in my early 40s here, in terms of the things that keep me up at night, it's this kind of stuff we're talking about right here. It's the parenting, how to navigate some of the nuances of these things, challenging your kids to be great, to be excellent, but making sure they're loved, and putting them in the right environments where they can learn all of the above. It's that's a weight that I feel a lot right now. So it's helpful to hear some of your reflections on it.
Yeah, yeah. And I will say too, our at the end of the day, we before every single sporting event, um, we'll have conversations where we're like, just so we're all aware, everybody has agreed stepping onto this field what the goal is. The goal is to win. And
Yeah.
so don't be ashamed of fighting fiercely to win. Why? Because everybody's agreed that this is the goal. And so it's not like so come in and compete like a dog. I mean, go after this thing. But as soon as you step off that field, you know that your value is already
Mm-hmm.
established and it's rooted. So we basically talk about that idea of, go after it, all those sort of things. But then we also, we'll basically at the end of all those sort of hype talks, it's always like, and remember, it's a game. Have fun. And part of what we're trying to do is help them see you're bigger than the moment.
Yeah,
It's your,
that's
your
right. The
value and
bigger
worth is
story.
bigger story. Yeah.
Yeah. One thing I do remember you telling me in one of those, conversations from our early days together, you told me that you thought Jesus would have been just the scrappiest pickup player.
True.
Do you still hold that belief?
Oh, absolutely. And I think because if we're honest, Jesus, he loves in such a way that I think he takes joy where he knows he knows the different ways that we're wired. He created us. And so the idea of competing for something and the fun that's tied up in that and doing it together as kind of a community, I think there's so much wrapped up in a sports team that truly does reflect what you do in life and how you live out life. And so I think you get out on the court and have a ton of fun and go after it, but at the same time, laugh and, smack you on the rear when you're walking past as he beat you up and maybe, stole it from you and went down and, dunked one on you or something like that. I don't, Jesus was calling enough to dunk. So I felt very,
I'm sure Jesus could dunk. Jesus wanted to dunk, he could dunk.
yeah.
Well, it makes me think about just this summer with my oldest. He's kind of on the AAU basketball circuit now and facing some stiff competition and getting challenged. And, we had a conversation midway through the summer where I kind of challenged him and just said, hey, what kind of competitor do you want to be? And I said, similar to what you're saying, I said, I want you to tell me. I want you to spend some time thinking about that. I want you to write something up, come back to me and say, this is how I want to compete, and this is what I want you to hold me to. So he comes back a few days later. He's like, I got it done. There's a short little thing, but it begins with, I'm a killer. And it was kind of like, okay, is that okay? Should I support that? And again, I think I thought of some of the things you had shared with me years ago. And so we talked through it, but in the end, I was like, okay, yeah, understood in a certain sense. I think it's okay to encourage my 13-year-old son to be a killer on the floor, as long as he understands the bigger story and that, once the game's over, I mean, these are just fellow kids and competitors and people made in the image of God. And so I do think there's a way to do the both and there, but yeah, it can be tricky to navigate both as a player and as a parent, I think.
Yeah. And I think one of the interesting things about it is, in some way on the court or on the football field or whatever sport it may be, getting into a fight with someone, to me, that's okay. We've way crossed the sort of killer mentality. If we can go out and compete and go hard and everything like that, but I still respect the fact that you bear the image of God. You still have value regardless of performance on this court. But I can come at you as hard as I possibly can because we have agreed that the nature of the sport is to try and win this game. Now, I'm not going to violate the rules of the game and play dirty and cheap shot you and all that kind of stuff to try and win this game.
Right.
There's parameters, there's boundaries, there's all that kind of stuff. But in terms of the mentality of winning, I want you to come at me as hard as you possibly can. Because that to me is the fun part. It's like we're going at this thing, we're competing this, and it's just, to me, that's part of the fun. In recognizing again that it's a game, it's a sport, it's got rules and boundaries and parameters, and we agree to those things, and that it's in the context of a much larger story.
Yeah.
And to me, that kind of mirrors how God's design for creation.
All right, let's switch topics. We're fast forwarding in your life. We're now in your mid-late 30s, and you make a career pivot of sorts, just a pretty significant shift in kind of your sense of calling and what you're focused on. And I can imagine maybe there are some listeners out there who are either, have made a similar kind of shift or preparing to, maybe thinking about it. And so I wondered if you could just share a little bit about that transition. I know there's a much longer version, but, just talk a little bit about kind of what led to that pivot, I'm sure there were people in your life in the midst of that, sort of confused, maybe questioning, are you sure this makes sense? And so share whatever you want to share about that pivot. And I'm specifically interested in sort of what gave you the courage and conviction you needed to press through with that pivot, even while it maybe didn't make complete sense to some people in your life.
Sure. Yeah, well, I'll give it a little context. So now we lead an organization called Aruna, and it's a anti-trafficking organization that combines the best of nonprofit and business together to try and create lifelong freedom for women who have lived experience of human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking. And I happened to be headed overseas, and I was in an airport, and I saw on a little ticker line on CNN, just on the little bottom, it made reference to 12 children being freed from a brothel. And I had no idea sex trafficking existed. Had no idea. And it kind of floored me. I thought, this is actually being reported on the news. And if it's to such scale that they're reporting it, how are we not all involved in trying to end some of this? And so I started to Google it and realized the very place that I was headed internationally was a significant destination location for sex trafficking. And so I told my wife, I said, when I get there, I'm going to find this.
Yeah.
And my goodness, I was not prepared. Outside of some meetings that I had, I ended up finding this particular area. And, as soon as I stepped in, the smell of stale, it's pitch black, and it's the middle of the afternoon, but as my eyes were adjusting to the darkness, and those massive rats, and I made my way through to this staircase, and I started up the stairs, and about midway up these stairs, I started to hear the sound of abuse. And I got to the top of these stairs and opened to this long corridor, and there were just these small closet-sized rooms, just these mattresses and wool curtains, and young women there who they were physically alive, but they were fully disassociated. And I was devastated. I had never seen anything like this before. I had never seen such crippling reality of human trafficking. The pimps learned pretty quickly that I wasn't there for sex, and so they escorted me out. And some of them, basically, it was just this boasting that you do-gooders show up a day late, leave a day early. And that whole attitude, I couldn't believe that right in front of me was this terrible issue of brutal people in positions of power and authority doing such wicked, evil things to people in such positions of vulnerability, and then just the arrogance to boast about.
Yeah.
And so for me, I ended up going back to all these other meetings and stuff like that, and coming back to the U.S., and I could not shake both the faces of some of those young and the audacity to claims, and couldn't shake it. And the more I talked with April, my wife, and we started crying about it, the more we said, all right, we've got to at least see, is there something we can do to help? And so that led us to actually move to the area for a couple of months. For kids at that time, 5, 3, 1. And quite honestly, the more we dug in, the more we realized, okay, based on all the learning, we met with government officials, nonprofit leaders, women here, asked 1,000 questions, mission guidance, methods, constraints, anything we could to try and understand, why is this happening? What solutions are being offered? Are they truly beneficial for the women trying to serve? And in all those questions, simply asking, is there any? And once we realized really quickly that there weren't simple answers, and help truly did involve being fully invested, we started to actually realize, all right, this may mean that we need to completely shift the trajectory where we've been going and actually fully invest our lives into this. And that was probably about a 3-year process. And then at the end of that 3 years, we said, all right, we're in.
And what was the people in your life who we're aware of some of these shifts were happening, but weren't on the inside of it, couldn't fully understand it. Like, was there resistance that you experienced as you kind of made that turn and really zeroed in on this particular mission God had given you? And yeah, what was that like, and what did it sort of require to sort of push through maybe some of that to no, this is what I need to be about now?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I always want to be in a position where I'm truly listening to the
Yeah.
outside people speak into my life because I think there's such value in that and seeing blind spots and things like that. Um, but there were an awful lot of voices that were saying things like, "Well, it's too dangerous," or "It's too difficult," and those sort of things. I find myself going, "Well, that's not a reason not to do this. If there's other more specific reasons, then that I'm all ears. But if you're just saying, hey, this is going to be too dangerous for you to help," I kind of look at it and go, Jesus calls us to a standard of being willing to literally lay down our lives for the sake of a person, to truly
Mm.
lay down your life. And what that means to lay down my life is, yes, it could literally mean I lose my life for the sake of, so that people, you lose all the future potential of what could have been for the sake of that person. But yeah, that's what Jesus says. And so if I'm going to take that seriously when somebody says, well, it's too dangerous, I'm kind of like, well, that's already been settled. On some of the other sides, we're a little bit more particular. When we developed out a model, we put together this concept of trying to build out a business where we would actually employ them because that significant needs was a landing place of sustained economic opportunity. And so it came back and again, this is at the end of this 3-year period, and kind of presented it to a group of business guys and kind of pitched this concept. And they all said, you're crazy. This is never going to work. You're never going to be able to make this thing work. And so, I couldn't get them to invest. Now, from their perspective, depending on why you're actually in business and what you're trying to do with business, I totally get it. The idea of
Mhm.
trying to bring value to your shareholder and things like that. I just thought, oh, okay, I need to listen. I need to listen to
Hmm.
why these guys would not invest. And so for me, that was a significant learning. That gave me significant pause to say, okay, I want to try and seek to understand this deeply. So there was some negativity on different sides. Some of it I found valuable, some of it
Yeah.
maybe wasn't as valuable.
But
But
I'm
at the
hearing you
end,
say you listened to it all.
yes, for sure, for
You
sure.
considered it all and, sort of put it through your value grid. And, some of that feedback, pushback proved to be, more helpful than others, but you weren't dismissive of anyone's thoughts there.
Sure. And some of it, was a pretty quick evaluation, and
Yeah.
some of it was, a little bit more lengthy. Um, and then certainly we had, people in our lives we were processing that with. Um, but it really came down to the simple question, honestly, for me was, if I were in the position some of these young women were in,
Mm.
what would I be hoping and desperately praying that
Mm.
someone would do for me?
Yeah.
And I just thought, if that prayer is happening, then perhaps God would allow us to be a part of that solution.
Yeah. Is that still to this day a thought that you have? I mean, do you think about such a person who's kind of hoping, praying, waiting for your help in a sense?
Yeah, I mean, the Lord has been there far before we were, and He'll, continue to work with or without us. But I'll just share one quick story. So typically, one of the rhythms that we'd be in is, after we built everything out, got the teams established, everything like that. I would, typically go back over to South Asia, on a quarterly basis, and I would meet with all of the young women who had been freed and recently come into employment from the company. And let me give just real briefly better context to that. So we have outreach centers in multiple red light areas where we create a pathway of freedom. Then we have a an apprenticeship program that has transitional housing, trauma counseling, skill and trade development. And then from there, that's kind of the nonprofit side. And the for-profit side, after they graduate from the apprenticeship program, they can then step into the business where they have transitional housing that leads to people where they have career wages, retirement savings, access to health care, ongoing trauma care, like developed out things, individualized care plans, and then even upward mobility in other ways, other options, opportunities. And they produce 100% of the products that Aruna sells, athleisure products, bags, and accessories. And then we bring those here to the U.S. and allows us to employ women who have been freed here from sex trafficking in the U.S. as well. But to get back to your particular question about the individual guys staying focused there, I was in the offals in South Asia with some of the new artisans, and I usually tell them, here's what business is, here's why we created it for you, here's where we're headed. And, ask them if they've got any questions or anything like that. Our aftercare specialists and counselors as well. And a few of them ask some questions. We have conversation. But just as everything seems to be ending, one young woman starts to speak, and she's speaking Hindi in a particular dialect. I understand some, but she was going super fast, started to get really emotional, and then she just started crying. And I thought, I kind of went into problem solving. Okay, what happened? And I kind of turned to our aftercare specialist to understand what she was saying. And she said, Ryan, 4 years ago, you were inside whichever brothel where she was held. And you were talking about this particular place where you were creating an opportunity for women like her. And she said 4 years ago, when she first heard you sharing that, she thought there's no way that's possible. There's no possible. But she said that single conversation planted a seed of hope. And now she finds herself right here 4 years later, overwhelmed with the reality that that seed of hope has taken root and is now blossomed in her freedom, where she's succeeding. And I just thought that seems to me to be the power of just one simple conversation in some of the darkest areas, where it's just a seed that can sprout into radical life change.
Yeah, that's an awesome story. Yeah, I mean, the work that you all are doing with Aruna is amazing. I've been tracking with it for a number of years. Got a chance to go on a visit with you some years back with a friend of ours, and couldn't be more behind it. But man, that's a big weighty mission, right? Lifelong freedom for victims of sex trafficking. I mean, that's in terms of scope and weight and complexity. Obviously I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But I can imagine there may be some listeners out there who, are not doing the exact same thing, but find themselves in a situation where they're leading some sort of effort, mission, endeavor that at times feels big, feels overwhelming, feels complicated. It's like, I don't know if I can take this on. What sort of advice would you give that person based on your experience, taking on this big problem in the world, knowing that it's not like there's a day in your lifetime you're going to wake up and say, well, problem fixed. That one's done with, right? What have you learned along the way there about how to carry a weight like that? And what advice would you give to another leader who is maybe feeling a similar tension?
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question. A couple of different things come to mind. One is the idea of segmentation. Another is the idea of owning what I should be owning nothing more. And so to talk on those two things, I'll start with the second one first, the owning what I can own. There's certain particular responsibilities that I need to take on. The faithfulness to making sure that we're thinking through the problems really well. We're attacking those problems really well. So we're working on identifying those problems. We're working on really understanding those problems well, diagnosing them, and really understanding at the point where we could bring the right solution to it. We can own out that process. when it comes down to what is the ultimate end result, when you're working with terribly traumatized people who are going to make some of their own decisions, regardless of how much what you do, I cannot try and carry those decisions. I can't carry the decision that a pimp is going to make that's outside of my ability. And so I think when we start talking about, generally speaking, people in general, for going after their vision, we've got to be able to say, okay, here are the things that I can be responsible for. I can be responsible for understanding the problem, developing out a good solution, and creating the strategy around it and the operational systems to move all forward, and try and do those with a level of excellence. But certain outside factors that are just beyond my control, I have to be able to say there's nothing I can do about this. I can respond to them. The second would be the segmentation part, is the challenge that I find to hold really big vision and day-to-day operational execution. The holding of those two things in tension, it will cause tension. There's a ton of training out there on this. I know that some of the elite military operations do this, where they talk about segmentation, where you literally segment out. If you get a massive vision of what they're going after, a massive scope of work, that you basically segment out the entire thing and say, okay, if we could hit these milestones, we'll be able to kind of get to this point. And so instead of looking at the whole thing, being overwhelmed by it, once you actually segment it all out, then you get really focused in on execution of the segment that's in front of you, and then move to the next segment, and then move to the next side. If you can do that kind of on a project basis, then you can stack project on top of project on top of project. The next thing you know, wow, we've made some really, really good headway in accomplishing the vision.
Yeah. It makes me think about something I read in a biography about Nick Saban, former Alabama coach. And this was really part of his genius, I think, was that segmentation piece you're talking about. And the motto within that program apparently was just win the next 7 seconds. The average football play is 7 seconds long. And he had his whole program segmented into the smallest chunks, and didn't matter what your role was. That was the mantra. Just go win the next 7 seconds, go win the next play, knowing that if we all have that mindset and we stack a bunch of those up, we're going to look up at the end of a season or a few years or a decade and have accomplished some really incredible things. And so that's what I hear you articulating there. All right, I'll get you out of here on this. A final question. I listen to a lot of leadership podcasts, read a lot of leadership books. They're all great, but maybe one, I don't know if frustration is the right word, but one thing I observe is that it's all fairly buttoned up, right? And you hear all these stories about maybe hard things that happen, but here's what I learned and now I figured it out. And, we've done some on this pod, and that's great. But I'm always curious, like, what are the things you're going to be talking about 5 years from now, 10 years from now, about right now? And so maybe put differently, like what's something from a leadership standpoint that you are presently wrestling with and just trying to sort out, and like, man, I hope over the next several years I get a handle on fill in the blank leadership thing, because I'm struggling right now and it's not clear kind of how I should be approaching it or engaging with it. Is there something in that vein that comes to mind from sort of present day Ryan Berg's leadership milieu?
Yes, I think people, as much as we want to operationalize and systemize things, I think there's just a limitation to being able to do that. And so, oftentimes when I hear about leadership, we'll talk about create this system, create this process, whatever. Kind of really, it's really, really sharp operational accountability to run like a well-oiled machine. And people aren't machines. And so the idea of trying to make sure that we actually are spending the time with people to hear them, to understand all of what's going on in their lives outside of the work world. This idea of being able to truly separate your work from your personal, I think you can do that in terms of value and all those sort of things. But when there's chaos in your personal life, it's going to affect the individual who's showing up at work that day. And so to be aware of that and to try and figure out, okay, well, how do we care for this person in the midst of what they're going through? Um, it's just literally before we got on, I was on a call with one of our teams, and uh, one of our staff lost her husband, and in the process of that loss, within the weeks that followed, almost lost her son as well. He was in critical condition in the hospital, and I just think, those are sort of things where how do we respond as leaders with people on our teams? And so I find the things that I think about much, much more are related to personal element. So not as much about the sort of big vision and everything like that, but how do we just, in Boy Scout Shepherd way, care for people and care for them well?
Yeah, boy, that speaks to me certainly in the heart of some of the things we're trying to do with our consulting work. Just, people aren't machines. I mean, just that statement right there, I think we'd all be well served to chew on, especially in this age of, artificial intelligence and technology and data.
Yeah. Well, it kind of does come back to that high value, identity, high value, high worth, and high challenge at the same time. If we've led well, we can be able to say to someone, "Hey, your performance on the team is not going well. I still value you as an individual performance on teams." And so when we talk about all the stuff that we're doing, we don't talk about us being a family. We talk about it being a team, because it may mean that a team member needs to step off the team. They're a longer part of the team.
Right.
But I'm never going to kick anybody out of my family. And so there's some nuances and dynamics, even just to the way that, the language of what we use, but the idea of trying to make sure that we're saying, yeah, you've got an incredible value and worth because of simply who you are as an in care of God. You've also got high level of responsibility in this organization, responsive. And so having those two, I think, together helps to try and actually lead through challenging environments.
Brody, if you're listening out there, you can breathe a sigh of relief. No matter how well your freshman season at Davidson goes, you are not going to get kicked out of the Berg family. You are safe.
Amen.
Well, Ryan, thank you so much for being my first guest. I couldn't have thought of a better person to do that. Someone I've learned so much from over the years and continue to, even just in this last hour, our conversation. There's things I'm thinking about, I'm chewing on, I want to follow up and talk with you about. And so appreciate your willingness to do this. Thankful for the work you're doing with Aruna. Before we get you out of here, just make sure people know if they want to learn more about Aruna, support the cause, buy the products, maybe get involved in an Aruna run, which we didn't talk about, but that's another component to it. Where should they go to learn more about the work you're doing with Aruna?
Yeah, they can just go to arunaproject.com. It's ARUNA project.com.
Go check it out. You will be glad you did. Ryan, thank you so much. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks for having me, Johnny. Appreciate it much, man.